The fucking silence was the loudest goddamn thing in the house. It wasn't just an absence of noise. It was a physical presence, a thick, suffocating blanket woven from grief and lemon-scented floor polish. It clung to the marble floors of the foyer, slithered up the grand, curving staircase, and pooled in the cavernous rooms of Jackson Blackwood's coastal Massachusetts mansion. It was a silence he'd paid millions to build and billions to furnish, only to have it become his tomb. Every day, Jax drowned himself in the savage, brilliant chaos of the stock market, trying to outrun the ghost of his dead wife and the two smaller ghosts she'd left behind. His twin sons, Noah and Liam, hadn't really spoken, not in a way that mattered, since the day they buried their mother. They moved through the sterile perfection of their home like porcelain dolls, their laughter and light shattered into a million silent pieces. But today, something was about to break. Today, Amelia Vance, the new housekeeper, was going to light a match in the mausoleum. She wasn't just a new employee. She was a wildfire in a sundress, a storm of patience and warmth. And in one explosive, unthinkable moment, on the sacred, grief-soaked bed where Jax's world had ended, she would bring his boys roaring back to life. But when one of them whispers a name that doesn't belong to her, the miracle will fracture, and a single word will threaten to burn everything to the ground. Who is this woman? And why does her presence feel like both a salvation and the ultimate betrayal? Stick around, because this isn't just a story about a grieving father. It's a goddamn resurrection. Before we dive into this hurricane of a story, let me ask you something. Do you believe a broken heart can ever truly be put back together? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're looking for stories that grab you by the throat and don't let go, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. You won't want to miss what's coming. Jackson Blackwood hadn't meant to come home before the market closed. The quarterly review in Boston had been a bloodbath, a massacre of projections and shareholder confidence that had ended 2 hours early. Instead of finding another fire to extinguish, another deal to savage, another problem to bury himself alive in, he'd barked at his driver, David, to just fucking drive. David, a man paid handsomely for his discretion and his ability to interpret Jax's grunts, had simply nodded and turned the Bentley back toward the iron gates of Seacliff Manor. Now, standing in the echoing foyer, Jax hesitated. The air was still, heavy with the scent of old money and new sorrow. He wasn't sure what he expected to find. The housekeeper, Amelia, should be finishing up in the West Wing. The boys would be wherever they were always, curled on the oversized leather couch in the den, staring at a screen that stared blankly back, or in their rooms, surrounded by toys they no longer touched. Silent, still, fragments of the life he'd once had. His polished Italian loafers made no sound on the plush runner as he climbed the stairs, his movements practiced, precise, hollow. His hand, the same hand that could sign away fortunes without a tremor, paused on the cold brass knob of his bedroom door. His room. Isabella's room. It was a monument to her absence, a space so perfectly preserved it felt like a museum exhibit titled "The Day the World Ended." He braced himself for the familiar Arctic chill that settled in his bones the moment he stepped inside, the void where her scent, her warmth, her life used to be. He turned the knob and pushed the door open, and the world tilted on its axis. The bed. His bed. Their bed. The ridiculously expensive custom-made monstrosity Isabella had picked out, with its Italian linens and hand-carved mahogany headboard, was alive. It was shaking, bouncing, convulsing with a riot of motion and sound that felt like sacrilege. Amelia, the housekeeper he'd hired less than a month ago, a woman he'd barely exchanged more than a dozen words with, was in the middle of it, her honey blonde hair flying, her face thrown back in a blaze of pure, unadulterated joy. She was laughing, a sound so rich and real it seemed to physically push the silence out of the room. And on either side of her, his sons, Noah and Liam, not lying silent, not staring at walls, not flinching from touch or folding into themselves. They were leaping, shrieking with a kind of wild, primal laughter that scraped against Jax's raw nerves. Their small bodies, which had seemed so fragile and heavy for so long, were now weightless, bouncing in time with hers, their little hands clutching at the sleeves of her simple cotton shirt, their faces flushed and alive with the kind of unfiltered glee he thought had died with their mother. Jax couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. He felt like a deep-sea diver who had surfaced too fast. The sound was too loud, the light was too bright. After 18 months of muted, gray quiet, he wasn't prepared. He wasn't ready. His grip on the doorknob tightened, the cold metal a desperate anchor in the tidal wave of sensation that was crashing over him. Amelia hadn't seen him. She had one hand instinctively reaching for Noah, who had stumbled mid-jump, steadying him with an effortless grace. Liam, meanwhile, was pulling at the corner of the duvet, laughing so hard his small frame trembled with the force of it. The bed groaned under their combined assault. The once sacred space transformed into something so human, so gloriously messy, it felt like a violation. But it wasn't wrong. No, it was something else entirely. Something Jax couldn't put a name to without shattering into 1,000 pieces. He hadn't heard his sons laugh like this since before everything. Liam lost his balance completely, tumbling sideways into Amelia's lap. She caught him in a single, fluid motion, wrapping her arms around him and pulling him into a soft, giggling heap. "That's what happens when you don't use your landing gear, little man," she said, her voice warm and playful between gasps of air. "You gotta bounce with rhythm, see?" It was a language the house had forgotten, a language Jax had forgotten. Liam looked up at her, his cheeks pink, his chest heaving. For a second, a pause fell over him. His smile wavered, not from fear, but from something deeper, something searching in his wide, dark eyes. And then he reached up, his small hand gripping her arm tightly, and laid his head against her shoulder. "Mommy," he whispered, the word breathless, a perfect, impossible syllable. One word, one name, one ghost. Jax staggered back, his shoulder hitting the doorframe. Amelia froze mid-laugh. Noah's bouncing slowed. Time didn't just stop. It folded in on itself, crushing the air from the room. That single word echoed with the force of a gunshot, shattering something deep inside Jax's chest, something he thought had petrified into stone months ago. He watched Liam bury his face against Amelia's shoulder, a small child seeking harbor in a storm, finding a port he thought had vanished from all maps. Amelia didn't correct him. She didn't flinch or pull away. She just held him tighter. Then she looked up. Her eyes, a startling shade of green, met Jax's across the room. The entire universe seemed to go still. She didn't scramble off the bed in embarrassment or offer a panicked apology. She just blinked, her chest rising and falling as if she, too, were trying to recalibrate reality. Her expression held no guilt. It held recognition, understanding. She knew. She knew what they had lost. She knew what Liam had called her, and she understood the devastating weight of it. Jax couldn't speak. He couldn't demand an explanation. He couldn't roar about what the hell she was doing on his dead wife's bed with his sons, because there was no fury rising in him. There was only something wild and foreign and terrifyingly fragile. Hope. The kind of hope he had buried 6 feet under. The kind he had locked behind every door in this God-forsaken house. He couldn't look away from her face. Soft, calm, radiant with a kind of love that didn't pretend to be anything else. She wasn't performing. She wasn't faking it. And his children, his broken, silent children, were alive again, right in front of him, reaching for a warmth they hadn't felt since their mother's last breath. Noah, oblivious to the emotional cataclysm unfolding, started bouncing again. "Again, Mia!" he yelled, the nickname tumbling out naturally. "Again!" His little fists pumped the air in triumph, as if he were conquering the very grief that had held them all hostage. Liam turned, still nestled against Amelia, and giggled, a raw, hiccuping sound of pure joy. And Amelia, Mia, looked back at them both with a smile that wasn't borrowed or temporary. It was real. Jax's feet were bolted to the threshold. His pulse was a frantic drum against his ribs. His mind scrambled to make sense of this new, impossible reality. How had this happened? What had this woman, this stranger, done that a legion of therapists and specialists, costing him a small fortune, had failed to do? And why, dear God? Why, instead of feeling the sting of replacement, did he feel something that tasted dangerously like relief? The question coiled around him, a serpent he didn't dare voice. To put words to it might shatter the fragile miracle blooming on his bed. This wasn't about a job description or professional boundaries. Amelia Vance had found her way into the locked vaults of his sons' hearts, and she hadn't used a key. She had sung, she had jumped, she had laughed, she had simply been present. Jax didn't move. He didn't speak. The room, the bed, the moment, it was all too much and yet somehow not enough. He watched Mia gently shift Liam off her lap, ruffling his hair with an instinct that felt so natural, it was heartbreaking. "Okay, one more big jump each," she said softly. "Then we all get some water before someone pukes on this very fancy bed. Deal?" Noah nodded with the solemnity of a judge, which only made her laugh again. Then her eyes found Jax once more, still standing in the doorway like a statue, unmoving, unreadable. Her smile faded just a fraction, as if she were finally remembering her place, the lines that were supposed to exist between them. But she didn't apologize. She didn't explain. She just looked at him, really looked at him. And in that quiet, heavy gaze, he saw the truth. She hadn't done this to impress him. She hadn't done this to cross a line. She had done it because two little boys were drowning in silence, and she had thrown them a lifeline made of joy. She stood there, his sons clinging to her hands. And he saw them. He really saw them for the first time in over a year, not as fractured reflections of his own grief, but as children, alive, healing, laughing, and Jackson Blackwood said nothing. He didn't need to. The sound of their laughter was filling every hollow space inside him. It was louder than grief, louder than memory, louder than doubt. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, he didn't feel the urge to retreat into the sterile safety of his office. He didn't think about the bed, or the rules, or the utter strangeness of it all. All he could do was watch, mesmerized, as the woman he had barely acknowledged painted color back onto his children's faces. Then Liam, still breathless, reached again for Mia's hand and whispered it once more, this time with a quiet certainty. "Mommy." This time Jax didn't flinch. His eyes stung, a sharp, unfamiliar burn. He let the word settle in the air, a fragile truce between the unbearable sorrow of his past and the terrifying possibility of a future. His world had cracked open in the silence, and all he could do was stand on the edge of it, witnessing the impossible. Mia smiled at the boys and helped them off the bed, but the moment was sealed, etched into the marrow of his bones. For the first time in 18 months, Jackson Blackwood saw not ghosts, but life. And in that single, breathtaking instant, his children were alive again, and the woman he barely knew stood at the epicenter of it all. Jax hadn't intended to become a ghost in his own house, but in the days that followed, that's precisely what he became. He moved through the cavernous halls with silent, measured steps, a predator stalking the edges of his own life. He timed his movements to avoid direct contact with Mia, yet he never strayed too far. He told himself it was caution, professional due diligence, but it was a lie. Deep down, it was something else entirely, a terrifying, magnetic fascination. He couldn't stop thinking about that moment in his bedroom. Liam's whispered, "Mommy," Noah's uninhibited laughter, and Mia, luminous in the afternoon sun, looking as if she belonged there, woven into the fabric of their lives. It unsettled him in a way he couldn't articulate, so he watched. From the shadows of doorways, from behind half-closed doors, from the top of the grand staircase, he became a voyeur of his own family's healing. He watched as Mia turned folding laundry into a theatrical performance, with mismatched socks becoming puppets that argued in silly, high-pitched voices. Noah and Liam, who once stared listlessly at cartoons, were now captivated, their giggles echoing in the cavernous laundry room. He watched her transform making pancakes into a messy, glorious lesson in counting chocolate chips. Her patience, seemingly infinite as batter, ended up on the floor, in their hair, and on the tip of her nose. The woman had no script, no instruction manual, yet the twins responded to her as if their very souls had been dormant, waiting for her specific frequency to awaken. Jax didn't know what to do with that information. The only thing he was certain of was that some fundamental structure within him, a rule, a wall, a belief he'd clung to like a shipwreck survivor, was beginning to quietly, dangerously crumble. It wasn't just her interactions with the boys. Mia carried herself with a quiet confidence that wasn't born from pride, but from presence. She never overstepped, never tried to impress him or suck up to him. When their paths did cross, she offered a respectful nod or a quiet, "Good evening, Mr. Blackwood," without expectation, her gaze direct but not challenging. And yet he found himself lingering in the spaces she'd just occupied. The kitchen, where she hummed old folk songs he didn't recognize while wiping down the counters. The upstairs hallway, where the faint echo of her laughter still hung in the air after a game of hide-and-seek. He felt ridiculous, a billionaire CEO skulking around his own home like a teenager with a crush. This woman was his employee. She was here to clean his house and look after his children. She was not supposed to matter. But she did. Against his will, against every rational thought, she did. What gnawed at him most was that word. Mommy. Not because Liam had said it. Children were confused. Grief was a labyrinth. But because of how naturally it had slipped from his lips, as if it were a truth his small heart had already accepted. As if some fragile, essential part of him had already latched onto her. Jax couldn't decide if that terrified him or gave him hope. Both emotions felt equally perilous, and he was a man who had built an empire on the meticulous elimination of risk, so he kept his distance. Physically, at least. But the nights betrayed him. When the house finally fell into that deep, profound quiet, and the boys were asleep, when Mia had retreated to her modest room near the service corridor, Jax would sit alone in his sprawling study, a glass of untouched whiskey sweating on the polished mahogany. He'd close his eyes and replay every detail he'd witnessed that day. He could hear their laughter, not the stifled, polite chuckles they gave the therapists, but the wild, uninhibited joy he had once taken for granted. And in those private, solitary hours, something deep inside him would twist into a painful knot. It wasn't just about his loss anymore. It was about what they were regaining. The twins were opening up, shedding layers of trauma like old skin, and it had absolutely nothing to do with him. That truth struck him like a physical blow. He had done everything right. He'd brought in the best specialists, the most renowned child psychologists. He'd structured their days with routines recommended by experts. And still, they had drifted further away from him, two small ships lost in a fog of sorrow. But Mia? Mia walked in with a bag of groceries and a bright, easy smile, and somehow began stitching them back together with nothing more than patience and play. He resented it. He admired it. He feared it. She was bringing light into places he had deliberately left dark, boarded up against the pain of memory. And once light gets in, it doesn't ask for permission to stay. It just exposes everything. The dust, the cracks, the emptiness. One afternoon, he watched from the library doorway as she sat on the floor with Noah and Liam, a battered box of old crayons between them. "Okay, what color is your favorite feeling today?" she asked, holding up a broken stub of blue crayon. Liam pointed a chubby finger at a vibrant green. Noah grabbed a sunny yellow. Mia drew a lopsided smiley face with crooked stick arms and announced, "This is Mr. Giggles. He only smiles when you share your sunshine." The boys nodded with grave solemnity. Moments later, Noah handed Liam the yellow crayon without being prompted. It was such a small thing, a minuscule gesture in the grand scheme of their grief. But Jax felt its impact like a shock wave. These were the moments he had begged for, coached them for, paid experts to elicit. And here they were, given freely, naturally, to Mia. He took a sharp breath and melted back into the shadows. His presence wasn't needed. That's what cut the deepest. For 18 months, he had been the sole grim guardian of their pain. Now he was being replaced. Not out of malice, not even intentionally. Simply because his boys had found a way to feel again. And that way wasn't through him. That kind of truth doesn't knock politely. It kicks down the door and takes up residence in your soul. And it left Jackson Blackwood feeling more like a stranger in his own home than ever before. And yet, he didn't ask her to stop. He didn't tell her to hold back or to draw new boundaries. He could have, legally, emotionally, out of sheer, wounded pride. But every time he was tempted to rebuild the wall around them, he remembered the sound of their laughter, and something in him would soften against his will. There was no manual for how to father grieving children. There was no roadmap for how to coexist with the woman who had, in a matter of weeks, become the sun in their small, healing universe. He had loved Isabella with a ferocity that still burned him. He still did. But love, he was beginning to realize, doesn't preserve itself in marble statues or cold, empty beds. It lives in motion. It lived in the way Mia wiped syrup off Liam's nose without a second thought, in the way Noah reached for her hand as if it were the most natural thing in the world. It lived in the unseen, the unsaid. And maybe, just maybe, it lived in allowing someone else to help carry the unbearable weight for a while. So Jax watched. Every day, every hour, afraid to step forward and terrified to turn away. He watched a stranger hold the shattered pieces of his life, knowing with a cold, gut-wrenching certainty that he could not do what she was doing. He told himself it was temporary, a phase. That Mia would one day leave, that this strange, unsettling chapter would end, and he would resume whatever hollowed-out version of life he had known. But the lie tasted like ash every time he repeated it, because nothing about what she was doing felt temporary. It felt rooted, permanent, necessary. And when he lay awake at night, alone in the king-sized bed that felt more like a raft in a desolate ocean, The house now too quiet again, without her gentle humming echoing from downstairs, he didn't think about balance sheets or hostile takeovers. He thought about his sons laughing. He thought about Liam saying, "Mommy." He thought about the way Mia held their gaze without flinching, as if she could see right into their wounded souls. He thought about the impossible warmth she had brought into a house built from ice. He wasn't sure if the feeling clawing its way up his throat was fear or guilt, but it was demanding to be felt. Amelia Vance was still just the housekeeper. She had no idea how profoundly she was changing everything. But Jackson Blackwood did. And in the oppressive silence of his room, he would let the sound of his children's laughter play again and again in his mind. A terrifying, beautiful symphony he both craved and feared. Amelia wasn't searching for anything. The evening had been ordinary, another quiet cleanup after the controlled chaos of dinner and bath time. The twins were already in their pajamas, babbling to each other in a mix of signs and newly rediscovered words as she folded the last blanket on the living room couch. She was straightening a cabinet near the bottom of a large built-in bookshelf, a space filled with old magazines and forgotten trinkets, when her hand brushed against something hard and flat, tucked far behind a stack of art books. Curious, she pulled it out gently. Dust clung to the glass like a fine gray shroud, time itself trying to hold it hostage. It was a photo frame, simple, silver, elegant, and forgotten. Inside, a woman beamed at the camera, her smile so radiant it seemed to generate its own light. Mia stared, a jolt of recognition hitting her with physical force. She knew this face instantly, not because she'd ever seen this photo, but because its features lived on in the faces of Noah and Liam. The brilliant, dark eyes, the slight curve of the chin, the shape of the smile. This was their mother. This was Isabella. Not a ghost, not a memory, but a vibrant, living presence captured in a silver frame. Mia sat back on her heels, the weight of the image settling in her chest. There was so much life in the woman's eyes, a vibrancy that couldn't be staged for a formal portrait. This wasn't a picture taken for mourning. It was love, frozen mid-laugh. Mia's fingers hesitated at first, a pang of uncertainty. Was this her place? But something deeper, an instinct she couldn't ignore, told her not to hide it again. With the hem of her sleeve, she wiped the glass gently, clearing away the years of dust, and carried it over to the grand fireplace mantel. She placed it at eye level, not with ceremony, but with quiet intention. This wasn't an act of rebellion. It was an act of restoration. Whatever fortress of grief Jackson had built around himself, his children deserved to know the face of the woman who had given them their eyes, their softness, their spark. She didn't know how he would react. And in that moment, she found she didn't care. This wasn't about him. This was for Noah and Liam. The next morning, she didn't mention the frame. She let it sit in quiet invitation. A window someone had forgotten was there. The boys were at the kitchen island, methodically eating cereal, when Liam noticed it first. He stopped mid-bite, his spoon dangling, his eyes locked on the photo across the room. "Mia," he said, his voice small. He pointed a chubby, milk-damp finger. Noah turned, his gaze following his brother's. He slid off his stool and crossed the room with a slow, dreamlike quality. Liam followed, abandoning his breakfast. Together they stood before the fireplace, two small boys in matching dinosaur pajamas, heads tilted, their faces a mask of silent, profound recognition. They couldn't articulate the flood of memory, but they could clearly feel it. Mia stayed back, her own breath caught in her throat. Noah reached out first, his tiny fingertip touching the cool glass, tracing the outline of his mother's smile. Liam copied him, his touch just as gentle. Then, in a broken but beautiful synchronicity. Their small hands moved from the frame to their chests, then out again in an unsteady but unmistakable sign. "Mama." Mia covered her mouth, a sob catching in her throat. Jackson entered the room seconds later, a tablet in one hand, already lost in the morning's market reports. The sight of his sons standing before the mantel stopped him mid-stride. His breath hitched, his chest tightening as if a fist had closed around his heart. His eyes darted from the boys, to the photo, then to Mia, his confusion hardening into a raw, incredulous shock. "Where did that come from?" His voice wasn't angry. It was something far worse. It was cracked, broken open. Mia turned slowly, her own eyes glistening. "I found it last night. It was hidden behind the cabinet. I thought they should see her." Jax's jaw clenched, but no words came. He took another step forward, and his knees nearly buckled. There she was. Isabella, not in a fleeting memory or a torturous nightmare, but here, smiling, so alive in a way he hadn't allowed himself to remember. The boys turned, oblivious to the emotional hurricane swirling inside their father, and made the sign again, this time with more confidence. "Mama," they repeated, a shared, proud secret they had just uncovered. Jax's hand shot out, gripping the back of a chair to steady himself. He wouldn't fall apart in front of them. He wouldn't. But the grief was no longer a silent, manageable weight. It was an avalanche. Seeing her face, hearing them sign that word, it shattered him. "I didn't mean to overstep," Mia said softly, taking a half step toward him, but not too close. "But they deserve to know her face." Jax couldn't respond. He was lost. Lost in the way Noah's finger moved along the outline of Isabella's cheek in the frame. Lost in the devastating realization that his boys did still remember her, not with words or stories he had failed to tell, but with something deeper. A muscle memory of the heart. Liam turned back to the photo, his face breaking into a wide, innocent smile that made Jax's throat close up. "Pretty," the little boy said, proud of his new word. "Mama, pretty." And again, the sign, so simple, so pure, so devastating. Mia looked at Jax then, her gaze not challenging, but grounding. She wasn't asking for his permission. She was holding space for him, for them, for the ghost between them. And for the first time, Jackson Blackwood didn't have the energy to fight the tidal wave of feeling crashing through him. He sank slowly onto the edge of the couch, his elbows on his knees, staring at the photo as if it were the first time he'd ever truly seen it. I put that away," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone. Mia nodded. "You did, but maybe it didn't want to stay hidden." He almost laughed, a dry, choked sound that died in his throat. He couldn't look at Mia. He couldn't look at the boys. He just kept staring at Isabella, at that frozen second in time when everything had still made sense. A part of him wanted to rage, to scream that he wasn't ready, that seeing her like this, happy, radiant, untouched by the pain she'd left in her wake, was too much to bear. But another part, the part he'd tried so hard to bury under balance sheets and bitter silence, wanted to whisper thank you. Not to Mia, not even to Isabella, but to his sons. For remembering. For keeping her alive in ways he never could. His fingers twitched against his knees. He hadn't cried since the funeral. Not really. Not where anyone could see. But this ache was different. It wasn't the kind that burns. It was the kind that breaks you open. And as Liam turned one last time toward the photo, raising his small hand with childlike joy to sign Mama again, Jax's breath began to tremble. The tears came slowly, as if asking permission. First one, then another. He didn't sob. He didn't crumble. He just sat there as his eyes, for the first time in so long, began to water. He blinked hard, trying to hold them back, trying to maintain some semblance of control. But Mia saw. She didn't speak. She didn't move. She simply stood there, a silent, steady witness, granting him the dignity of his grief. The twins didn't notice. They were too engrossed in the woman in the frame, their small voices whispering her name in a fragile mix of signs and syllables. And in that impossible, heartbreaking moment, grief stopped being a wall. It became a bridge between past and present, between memory and life, between a father and his sons. For the first time since he'd stood graveside in a black suit that felt too tight, tears pressed at Jackson Blackwood's eyes, and he finally let them fall. Mia didn't start learning American Sign Language because someone told her to. No one even knew. It began in secret, late at night, after the boys had gone to sleep, and the grand house had settled into its deep, lonely stillness. She would sit cross-legged on the floor of her small room, a single lamp casting a warm glow on the pages of her notebook. It was filled with scribbled letters, hand-drawn diagrams, and her own shaky attempts at drawing hand shapes. On her phone, propped against a stack of books, old instructional videos played on a loop. She would pause and rewind endlessly, her brow furrowed in concentration, determined to get each subtle movement right. Happy, she'd whisper to herself, her fingers forming the sign slowly, painstakingly, as she watched her own reflection in the dark window pane. Happy. It wasn't just a lesson. It was a mission. A promise. She didn't just want to comfort Noah and Liam. She wanted to meet them where they were, to speak to them in their world. Spoken words were only half the battle. Signing, even her clumsy beginner's version of it, felt like building a bridge across a chasm no one else had even tried to cross. She practiced until her hands ached, meticulously correcting the position of each finger, devouring online articles about childhood language development and bilingual communication in trauma survivors. This wasn't about showing off or impressing her employer. It was about seeing them. Truly seeing them. She knew, with an instinct that hummed deep in her bones, that even a small, imperfect attempt to learn their language would mean more than any gift or toy ever could. She waited a few days before trying it out. The timing had to be right. She wanted it to feel like a discovery, not a forced lesson. That afternoon, while they were playing with blocks on the thick rug in the sunroom, she sat down beside them, humming softly. Then, without any preamble, she placed her flat hand over her chest, made a soft, upward brushing motion, and looked at them with wide, curious eyes. "Do you guys know what this means?" she asked, her voice gentle but bright with excitement. Noah looked up from his block tower, his expression puzzled. Liam blinked at her hand, confused. She repeated the motion, more deliberately this time. "Happy," she said clearly, signing it again, and then breaking into a wide, genuine smile. "Happy." Liam's face suddenly lit up, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. He clumsily mimicked the sign, his small hand flailing for a moment before landing on roughly the right shape. Mia gasped dramatically, clapping her hands together. "Yes! That's it, buddy! You did it!" Noah watched, slower, more focused, his brows furrowed in intense concentration. He made the sign, his version a little crooked but earnest. "Happy," he whispered under his breath. It wasn't just a word, it was a connection. It saw a key turning in a long, rusted lock. A victory. Mia beamed, her heart feeling like it might burst. She reached out and ruffled both their heads. "You guys are so smart," she whispered, her own eyes suddenly damp. "I am so proud of you." Jax had been standing in the doorway long enough to see the whole exchange. He hadn't meant to eavesdrop. He was just passing on his way to the study. But when he heard Mia's soft voice and the boy's responsive murmurs, something had pulled him in like a gravitational force. He leaned against the doorframe, his arms folded tightly across his chest, his eyes fixed on their small, clumsy hands, trying to replicate a gesture he didn't understand. But when Mia spoke the word happy, and he saw the way Liam's face ignited with pure, unadulterated recognition, something cold and sharp twisted deep in his gut. Shame. Thick, heavy, and suffocating. It wrapped around his ribs like a vice. He had never learned to sign. Not when the doctors first mentioned their language regression after the accident. Not when the therapists suggested visual aids and communication cards. Not even when Isabella died, and the boy's words began to fade one by one, like lights going out in a storm. He had buried himself in work, in guilt, in excuses. He'd told himself he didn't have the time, that it was what the professionals were for. And now, a woman who hadn't known them for 6 weeks was sitting on his floor, speaking a language to his sons that he had never even tried to learn. His jaw clenched so hard a muscle jumped. He wanted to turn and walk away, to retreat to the safety of his office and pretend he hadn't seen. But he couldn't. He was frozen, watching as Mia signed another word, then another, her movements slow and patient. The boys were trying. They were trying so hard, and they were happy. Not because of him, but because of her. That realization hurt more than he could have anticipated. Steeling himself, he stepped into the room. Mia looked up, a flicker of surprise in her eyes, but she didn't stop. She just smiled a small, hesitant smile and signed the word again. Happy. Jax crouched down beside her, his expensive suit pants creasing, his body feeling awkward and out of place. Can you show me?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Mia's expression softened. She nodded and gently guided his large, stiff hand. "Palm flat, touch your chest here," she said softly. "Then brush up. Twice. That's happy." He mimicked her motion, his hand trembling slightly. "Happy," he repeated, the word cracking in his throat. Liam squealed with delight and clapped his hands. Noah giggled. "Happy!" they both chorused, mimicking him. And then, without any prompting, Liam turned to him, his eyes shining, and made a different sign. His small hand, fingers together, touched his chin, then pulled down and away. Mia paused, her breath catching. Jax looked on, confused. "What's that one?" he asked. Mia's voice was a whisper. "That's the sign for Papa." Liam, seeing his father's confusion, repeated it with a laugh. "Papa?" Noah joined in, a gleeful grin spreading across his face, both boys now signing and saying the word with an uncontained joy that felt like a physical force in the room. Jax's mouth fell open slightly, but no words came out. Only a sudden, intense heat rising behind his eyes, fast and unforgiving. His hands dropped to his thighs as he sat back on his heels, watching them, his vision blurring. The word echoed in the chambers of his heart, louder than any boardroom ovation or eulogy ever had. Papa. He hadn't heard them say it with such life, such pure happiness, in over a year. And now here it was, twice over, wrapped in giggles, lifted by small hands, and offered to him so freely, so unconditionally. He closed his eyes for a brief second, willing himself not to break. But it was too late. The dam had cracked. Mia reached over and laid a hand on his arm, her touch firm and grounding. "You're doing good, Jax," she said softly. "They see you." He could only nod, unable to speak, letting the sound of their unrestrained laughter seep into the cracks of his armor. His own fingers moved, almost on instinct, clumsy and uncertain. "Papa," he whispered, shaping the sign again, this time with a little less tremble. The boys lit up once more, scrambling into his lap, wrapping their small arms around his neck. "Papa, Papa!" He laughed, a raw, broken sound that was half sob, half joy. Real tears, the kind that burned, the kind that healed, traced paths down his cheeks. And for the first time since Isabella's death, Jackson Blackwood didn't feel like a man frozen in a photograph. Distant, unreachable, a monument to what was lost. He felt present. He felt seen. He felt like a father. Not just to his sons, but somehow to himself. Isn't that just incredible? A single word, a simple gesture, and a whole world begins to change. If moments like this touch your heart and remind you of the power of connection, please give this video a thumbs up. It lets us know we're on the right track. And if you haven't already, consider subscribing. We pour our hearts into these stories, and having you here with us makes it all worthwhile. Mia said nothing else. She simply sat back and let the moment live, unspoiled, perfect in its beautiful, messy simplicity. The twins practically danced around the room, practicing their new signs with theatrical exaggeration. And Jax tried each one, fumbling, laughing at his own mistakes, and trying again. Mia stayed beside him, correcting his hand shapes gently, encouraging him always. The lesson stretched long into the afternoon, but no one was keeping track of time. Time had shifted. Something fundamental had broken free, and as his sons shouted his name again and again, with their voices and with their hands, Jax knew this was not a moment he would ever forget. It wasn't just a breakthrough, it was a homecoming. And as their delighted squeals filled the sunroom, undoing him completely, he didn't try to stop it. For the first time in a very, very long time, he didn't want to. The fragile peace had lasted for nearly 2 weeks. In that time, something had shifted not just in the boys, but in the very atmosphere of the house. The twins spoke more, signed more, and explored their world with a renewed curiosity. Liam had started stringing 2-word sentences together, and Noah, once so hesitant to make eye contact, now routinely brought books to Mia, gesturing insistently for her to read. Jax had begun to emerge from the shadows. No longer just a ghost in the doorways, he would sit with them, sometimes in silence, sometimes asking Mia to show him a new sign. He'd even signed thank you to her once, his hands still uncertain but his eyes sincere. It wasn't a perfect, linear recovery. There were still tantrums, moments of regression, and nights when the weight of memory would steal their progress away. But Mia kept showing up with that same quiet, unwavering strength, and Jax found himself daring to hope. Not wildly, not yet. But just enough to start wondering if the light he saw in his son's eyes might actually last. It was that small, dangerous kernel of hope that made him agree to Dr. Albright's visit. The boy's pediatric neurologist had been requesting an updated assessment for months, and Jax, bolstered by their recent progress, finally relented. He called it a check-in, softening the clinical language, as if doing so could protect the fragile magic they'd built from the harsh glare of scrutiny. Mia had been cautious. Maybe we could wait a few more weeks, Jax, just to let them settle into it more. But Jax, hungry for professional validation, for a piece of paper that would prove this wasn't all in his head, had brushed off her concern. "They're ready," he'd insisted, his voice more confident than he felt. "They've come so far." When Dr. Albright arrived, with his crisp suit, leather-bound clipboard, and eyes as impersonal as a security camera, the warmth in the house began to curdle. The boys, initially excited by a visitor, shrank back the moment they were asked to perform. Simple questions were met with blank stares. When asked to sign familiar words like ball or more, Liam turned his face into Mia's shoulder and refused to lift his hands. Noah, always more sensitive to pressure, burst into tears when Dr. Albright tried to adjust his posture mid-task. Mia tried to explain, her voice soft and supportive. "They do it all the time when we're just playing. The pressure." But her words were drowned out by the doctor's impatient sighs and clinical murmurs about limited retention and inconsistent milestone acquisition. After 15 agonizing minutes of observation, Dr. Albright stood and delivered his verdict with all the delicacy of a gavel. "What you're describing, Mr. Blackwood, is what we call anecdotal improvement at best," he said, flipping through his notes with a dismissive air. "I understand the excitement of seeing behavioral change, especially in grief-affected children, but we must be careful not to mistake emotional bonding for neurological progress. The signing is inconsistent and not yet reliable as a primary communication tool. I would caution against building expectations on such unstable ground." His words landed like a physical blow. Jax stared at the man, then at his sons, who were now completely silent, clutching Mia as if she were the only safe thing in the room. A hot, roaring surge of emotion flooded his chest. Shame, anger, humiliation. He had wanted proof, and instead, he'd been handed a clinical dismissal of his hope. Worse still, the boys' regression, their failure, had happened under his watch, under her care. In that toxic moment, he didn't know who he was more furious with, himself for daring to believe, or Mia for making it all seem so real. He didn't explode immediately. He was a master of control. He waited until the door had closed behind Dr. Albright, until the boys had wandered into the hallway, dazed and confused, clinging to Mia's hands. Then he turned on her, his voice tight with a cold, suppressed rage. "You told me they were better." Mia looked at him, her brow furrowed with a mix of concern and hurt. "They are better, Jax. One bad moment under pressure doesn't erase weeks of progress." "Don't," he snapped, his voice dangerously low. "Don't you dare patronize me. You sold me a fantasy. You gave me false hope." Mia physically recoiled, as if he'd slapped her. "False hope?" she repeated, her voice a wounded whisper. "You saw them laugh. You saw them speak. You sat on the floor with us and learned their language. That wasn't a lie." But he couldn't hear her. Not through the thick, suffocating fog of his own disappointment and shame. "You had them signing like trained parrots for fun, but the second they're under real observation, they shut down. You don't understand what's at stake here. The long-term implications." Her face hardened, her green eyes flashing with a sudden fire. "Oh, I think I do," she said, her voice dropping, losing all its warmth. "You mean you don't want to look like a fool in front of your fancy doctor?" He flinched, the truth of her words hitting him with the force of a punch. He was furious and exposed. "You don't get to judge me. You don't get to judge how I handle my own children. You're an employee, Amelia. You work for me. Remember that." The words hung in the air between them, ugly and irrevocable. Her lips parted, hurt spilling into her expression like a silent scream. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She simply nodded once, a sharp, final gesture, took Noah and Liam by the hand, and led them upstairs without another word. The silence that fell in the aftermath was a different kind of silence. It was worse than the old, grief-stricken quiet. This one was cold, heavy, and full of jagged, unspoken things. Gone was the sound of Mia's gentle humming. Gone were the whispered bedtime stories and softly spoken affirmations. The laughter that had begun to echo down the hallways vanished completely. The boys reverted so quickly it made Jax physically nauseous. Liam refused to eat for an entire day. Noah had an outburst so violent it ended with a shattered table lamp and a split lip from falling. And through it all, Mia remained dutiful, but distant. She performed her tasks with chilling precision, But there was no warmth left in her presence, no spontaneous puppet shows with socks or turning mopping into a dance. She spoke only when absolutely necessary, and even then, her voice was flat, her expression unreadable. The twins clung to her wordlessly, as if her physical body alone was their anchor in this new, cold sea. Jax tried once to bridge the chasm he'd created. He caught her in the hallway and started a sentence, a half-hearted, clumsy apology that began with, "About the other day." But Mia looked at him with such profound, quiet disappointment that the words turned to ash in his mouth. He couldn't finish. He didn't know how to say he was wrong. Not yet. And so the house returned to its stillness. Not the fragile peace of healing, but the cold, heavy quiet of a fresh wound. Jax buried himself in meetings again, staying later at the office, leaving earlier in the mornings. But even amid boardroom battles and investor calls, his mind remained fixed on the moment he'd thrown it all away. Liam's joyful papa, Noah's trusting eyes, Mia's steady, unwavering belief in them. He saw her now only through glass, through stair railings, through the half-open doors of his study, even through the security footage on his phone that he wasn't proud of watching. She never looked toward the cameras. She never looked for him. But he watched anyway. Not because he didn't trust her, but because he no longer trusted himself. Every night he returned to the same suffocating conclusion. He had broken something that had only just begun to heal. And he had no idea how to fix it. He wasn't ready to face her, wasn't ready to admit how much she, and the hope she represented, mattered. And so the house waited, its newfound warmth fading by the hour, holding its breath until someone was brave enough to dare to reignite it. That night, sleep was a distant country Jax couldn't find his way to. He paced the length of his study, the rich Persian rug muffling his restless steps. The whiskey he'd poured sat untouched, its amber depths offering no solace. His chest throbbed with a dull, persistent ache that no business contract or market victory could soothe. There was a tremor in his hands he hadn't felt since the funeral, a low-grade internal vibration that refused to settle. He knew what it was. It was a reckoning. There was something inside him, a final ghost, demanding to be faced. And it had waited long enough. He stopped in the center of the room, his eyes falling on the bottom right drawer of his antique desk, a drawer he hadn't opened in nearly 2 years. With hesitant, trembling fingers, he pulled it open. The drawer slid smoothly, revealing a single, yellowing envelope. Its corners were curled, its seal unlicked, the address line blank. He stared at it, his heart beginning a slow, heavy drum against his ribs. It was the letter. The one he had written to Isabella 6 months after she died, but had never found the courage to send into the void. He lifted it out as if it might burn him, its weight impossibly heavy in his hand. He sank into the worn leather of his chair, and, taking a deep, shuddering breath, he read it. Every word, every raw, shameful confession, the letter had been written on his darkest night. He remembered it with perfect, painful clarity. The boys had refused dinner again. Noah had screamed for 3 solid hours, an inconsolable wail of pure misery, while Liam had hidden under the dining room table, silent and unreachable. Jax had felt utterly, completely defeated, crushed by the brutal realization that there was no one else coming. No cavalry, no magic fix. The weight of solo parenthood, of their bottomless grief, had seemed like a physical thing, trying to collapse his lungs. In the letter, he had poured out all the poison. He confessed the stark, abject terror he felt every morning upon waking, the paralyzing fear that he could not give his sons what they needed. He wrote about the crushing guilt, the helplessness, and, worst of all, the creeping, insidious thought that they would be better off with someone else. It wasn't a farewell note. It was a howl of desperate, unbearable honesty. He hadn't written it for closure or healing. He had written it because it was the only way he could scream without waking the children. Now, reading it again, the words gutted him. Not because they were no longer true, but because, in some fundamental way, they still were. He hadn't stopped fearing that he wasn't enough. And yet, something had changed. Mia, the boys, the music in the kitchen, the way his sons had looked at him just days ago. Not with pity, not with hollow absence, but with joy, with expectation. As if he belonged in their world again, he held the letter in his hands for a long, silent time before making a decision that his logical, calculating mind couldn't fully comprehend. Rising from the chair, he walked quietly through the sleeping house, each step deliberate. He paused outside Mia's door, the letter clutched in his hand, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm. This was not a man handing over a document. This was a man laying his soul bare. He knocked softly, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. After a few seconds, the door creaked open. She stood there in a simple t-shirt and pajama pants, her hair pulled back, her eyes tired but instantly alert. "Can I talk to you?" he asked, his voice rough with unshed emotion. She didn't hesitate or question him. She simply stepped aside, letting him in. Her room was small, neat, and impersonal, a stark contrast to the life she brought to the rest of the house. He didn't speak right away. He just held out the letter. "Please," he whispered, his voice breaking, "read this." She took it from his trembling hand and sat on the edge of her bed, holding the fragile paper with both hands, her brow furrowed in quiet concentration. Her eyes moved slowly across the lines, absorbing each sentence with the reverence of someone hearing a sacred confession. Jax stood awkwardly by the door, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, feeling stripped bare, trying not to crumble under the weight of her silence. About halfway through, she sniffled softly. Her thumb brushed the edge of the page, her lips parting slightly. By the time she reached the end, her eyes were swimming with tears. She looked up at him, her voice barely a breath. "Oh, Jax, you were hurting so badly." He could only nod, a knot of emotion too thick in his throat to allow for words. She stood and crossed the small room to him, the letter still held gently in her hand. "This wasn't weakness," she murmured, her gaze unwavering. "This was love. A love so big it was breaking your own heart." Her free hand came up, resting lightly over his chest, right where the ache was most intense. "She would have been so proud of you. Not for your money, not for holding everything together so perfectly, but because you stayed. You tried." Jax had no words for the seismic shift that occurred inside him in that moment. Something ancient and rigid, an armor of pride and self-loathing he hadn't even known he was still wearing, cracked and fell away. Her words didn't fix him. They didn't magically erase the pain or the years of guilt. But they made him feel seen, human. And more than that, they made him feel forgiven. Not by Isabella, that was a grief he would carry forever, but by someone who had seen him at his absolute worst, in all his brokenness, and had chosen not to look away. Mia didn't offer pity. She offered him truth. And in that truth, there was dignity. They didn't embrace. There was no dramatic swell of music, just a silence that felt different from all the other silences that had filled the mansion. This one wasn't empty. It was full of understanding, of grace, of a shared humanity that transcended their roles as employer and employee. She returned the letter to him, and he folded it gently, holding it now like something precious, not shameful. "Thank you," he managed to say. She just nodded, her eyes still soft with tears. He left her room quietly, the letter clutched in his hand. But it no longer felt like a confession of failure. It felt like a bridge, a thread between the broken man he had been and the man he was just now, tentatively becoming. He returned to his study, slid the drawer open, and placed the letter back inside. But this time he didn't shut it completely. He left it ajar, a quiet reminder that some things shouldn't be hidden away in the dark anymore. The house was quiet, but for the first time in a long time, he no longer feared the silence. Tomorrow would come, with all its weight and all its tests. But tonight, for one fragile, irreplaceable moment, Jackson Blackwood was not a widower or a billionaire. He was simply a man who had faced his deepest fear and discovered, at long last, that he was not alone. Spring crept into King's Harbor not with a grand announcement, but in a series of tiny permissions. Windows were cracked open to let in the salt-tinged air. Heavy sweaters were swapped for lighter shirts. Shoes were abandoned by the back door in favor of bare feet on the cool, damp grass. Mia, watching the way the bright sunlight made the boys squint and giggle as it streamed through the kitchen window, decided that today would not be a day for vacuuming or folding laundry. It would be a day for motion. With a small basket of craft supplies, she created a winding, whimsical trail across the sprawling backyard, staking colorful ribbons into the soft earth, each one fluttering in the gentle breeze like a tiny, joyful flag. She called it the Dragon's Tail Path, telling Noah and Liam with animated signs and an excited whisper that brave heroes had to race the wind to catch the dragon before it flew away. The boys' eyes sparkled. Without a moment's hesitation, they were off, darting from one ribbon to the next, their small legs pumping, stumbling and scrambling back up with a pure, unthinking joy that needed no translation. Their laughter bounced between them like a bright, colorful ball. Mia stayed back near the porch, watching, letting their energy carry the day. From the stone veranda, Jax watched silently, a forgotten coffee cup in his hand, his arms folded tight against his chest, as if holding himself together. He hadn't intended to stay outside. He'd only come out for a breath of fresh air, but the sight of his sons moving with such freedom, such untethered abandon, held him captive. He wasn't prepared for what came next. One moment he was trying to rationalize the scene, to distance himself with his usual internal monologue. "They're just playing. Don't read into it. They'll tire out soon." But then Liam tripped, rolling onto the soft grass, laughing so hard his little body shook. And Noah, instead of continuing the race, turned around mid-run, his tiny sneakers skidding on the grass, his arms lifted with innocent command. He faced the porch, his eyes locking onto Jax with a piercing, unwavering clarity, and he signed with both hands, the movements clean and sure. "Come, Papa." There was no mistake. It wasn't a mimicry or a moment of confusion. It was a call. Direct, deliberate, and undeniable. The ribbon path might as well have been a bridge spanning the vast, silent canyon between them, and in that instant, Jax realized he was the one standing on the wrong side. His throat closed, the air catching somewhere between his past and his present. It wasn't just a sign. It was forgiveness. It was an invitation. It was a declaration that he still mattered, that he could still belong. The porcelain cup in his hand dropped onto the stone steps with a dull thud, but he didn't hear it. His feet moved before his brain could protest. He ran. Not a jog or a polite pace, but the clumsy, awkward, all-out gallop of a man who had forgotten how to play. His expensive shoes twisted in the soft turf. His knees protested, but his heart was beating a wild, frantic rhythm against his ribs. Noah let out a triumphant squeal and opened his arms wide. Liam scrambled to his feet and joined him, both of them now racing toward their father. When Jax reached them, he didn't slow down. He dropped to his knees so hard he knew it would leave bruises, but he didn't care. His arms swept them up in one powerful, desperate motion, clinging to them like a drowning man clings to a life raft. The boys shrieked with laughter against his chest, their small hands patting his back, their warm bodies pressing into him without an ounce of hesitation. And Jackson Blackwood, the man who had built walls of silence so high not even light could penetrate them, finally, completely, broke apart. He sobbed. Not quiet, dignified tears, but messy, ragged, gut-wrenching sobs that stole the strength from his spine and shook his entire body. He buried his face in the space between their small shoulders, letting go of years of grief, of guilt, of fear he didn't even know he was still carrying. The grass was damp against his knees, his suit pants were ruined. But in that moment, he was not a CEO or a widower. He was only a father. From the edge of the garden, Mia stood frozen. She hadn't meant to watch. She had only walked over to adjust the last ribbon, to be sure the wind hadn't carried it off. But when she looked up, the sight before her unraveled her completely. Jax, crumpled on the grass, weeping into the shoulders of the very children he once feared he was losing. And the boys, responding not with confusion or fear, but with pure, instinctual love, as if they had only been waiting for him to cross the invisible line he had drawn around himself for so long. Mia didn't interrupt. She didn't move. Her hand slowly lifted to her chest, her palm pressed flat as if trying to quiet the frantic beating of her own heart. Her eyes glistened. For a fleeting, sacred moment, she felt she was witnessing a miracle. Not the loud, flashy kind, but the quiet, profound kind that happens in the raw, exposed places of the human heart. She had given them ribbons. They had given each other everything else. She swallowed back her own tears, letting the moment belong entirely to them. The hug lasted for a long time. Jax didn't want to let go. Every time he thought he had composed himself, Liam would giggle into his collarbone, or Noah would look up at him with those wide, trusting eyes, and another sob would erupt, uninvited and uncontrollable. But this time, he didn't feel ashamed. He didn't feel like a man who was failing. He felt like a man who was trying, and that, he was beginning to understand, was what mattered. When he finally pulled back, his face streaked with tears and dirt, both boys reached up to touch his cheeks, their small fingers brushing the wetness away with gentle curiosity. "Papa sad," Liam signed, his fingers clumsy but his meaning clear. Jax laughed, a broken, beautiful sound, and nodded. Then, with a hand that still trembled, he signed back slowly. "Papa happy. Now." It wasn't perfect ASL, but the boys understood perfectly. They giggled and hugged him again, a fierce, wonderful hug. And he knew, in the marrow of his bones, he knew they were healing. And so was he. Months passed, marked not by the pages of a calendar, but by the changing landscape of the house itself. The corners of the mansion were now softened by stray crayons, muddy sneakers left in the hallway, and the sudden, frequent bursts of laughter that echoed from room to room. The oppressive silence that had once wrapped the estate like a shroud had long since been torn away, replaced by the messy, beautiful noise of life being lived aloud. Jax, who had once buried himself in the sterile comfort of spreadsheets and contracts, now found his phone battery was often dead, abandoned on a counter in favor of chasing Noah around the yard with a foam sword or letting Liam style his hair with a collection of mismatched butterfly clips. Mia's presence, once confined to the discreet shadows of her job, now stretched freely into every part of their lives. She had become the heart of the home, a steady, warm presence that guided, soothed, and celebrated them. Even the household staff, once so rigid and formal, had begun to smile more, drawn into the orbit of the warmth she radiated. It wasn't perfect. There were still tantrums, broken plates, and nights when grief would tug quietly at their sleeves. But the mansion no longer suffocated them. It breathed with them. On a warm Saturday evening in late summer, Jax did something he hadn't done in years. He invited people in, not business partners or formal acquaintances, but real people. Neighbors, a few old friends from college, the ones who hadn't given up on him during the dark months. A makeshift garden party took shape under the wide, ancient oaks behind the house. Folding chairs, coolers of lemonade, and mismatched tablecloths. It wasn't elegant or impressive, but it was theirs. Noah darted between guests with a blue towel tucked into his shirt as a cape, announcing himself as Captain Super Noah. Liam wore a crooked pirate hat and asked every adult if they'd seen his buried treasure, which turned out to be a lunchbox filled with cookies. The twins signed eagerly to anyone who would listen, giggling when someone got a sign wrong, patient when they got one right. Their joy was unfiltered, contagious, and so absolute that several guests found themselves blinking back unexpected tears. Jax stood beneath one of the trees, a paper cup in his hand, though he hadn't sipped from it. His eyes scanned the yard, not searching for threats or problems, but simply witnessing. He saw Noah trying to teach a neighbor's golden retriever how to sign sit. He saw Liam chasing Bubbles with a look of fierce determination. And in all of it, in their freedom and their light, he saw Isabella. Not with the sharp sting of loss, but with the gentle warmth of memory. She would have loved this. She would have laughed at the chaos, hugged the kids until they squirmed, and teased him relentlessly for burning the hot dogs. But more than that, he knew, somehow, in the deepest part of himself, that she would have been grateful for Mia, for the way she held their children's hearts so carefully, for the patience she poured into their healing, and for the quiet strength she offered to Jax's most broken pieces. He watched as Mia stood on the porch, laughing with one of the neighbors. She was wearing a simple yellow sundress the boys had insisted on picking out for her from an online catalog, because, as Noah had signed, it was the color of happy. His feet moved before his thoughts caught up. He walked over to her side and said nothing at first, just stood there with her, both of them watching the boys shriek their way through a game of tag. Then, without turning his head, he spoke, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "You brought them back to me," he said, and then paused, his throat tightening. "And you brought me back to them." Mia turned slowly, her smile softening at the edges as she saw the raw emotion in his eyes. Her hand reached out, a simple grounding touch on his forearm. "They never left, Jax," she whispered. "They were just waiting for you to see them again." He blinked quickly, biting the inside of his cheek, but the lump in his throat wouldn't dissolve. "And me?" he asked, his voice almost childlike. "Were you waiting for me?" Mia's smile was small, but it held the whole world. "You were worth waiting for, too." They didn't kiss. They didn't need to. The moment was enough, full and sacred in its stillness. A kind of profound peace settled between them. Not the end of pain, but the beginning of something stronger, something earned. It didn't take long for the boys to notice their father had wandered off. "Papa!" Noah shouted, pointing with glee. Liam waved both arms and made a beeline across the yard, nearly tripping over his own feet. They reached their parents, breathless, tugging on their hands, demanding attention, as children do. "Blanket time," Noah insisted, pointing to the large quilt spread beneath the tree, where juice boxes, stuffed animals, and a half-finished puzzle waited. "You too, Mamma Mia," Liam added, using both his voice and the sign for Mama, his affectionate name for her now a natural part of their language. Mia's eyes flickered to Jack's, a silent question. There was no hesitation in his gaze, just a soft smile, full of awe, and a nod. Together they followed the boys to the blanket. And there, under the fading gold light of the summer evening, the four of them collapsed in a tangle of arms and laughter. Jax lay back, one arm behind his head, the other wrapped around Liam. Mia sat with Noah curled into her side, his fingers idly playing with the hem of her dress. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was restful, rich, and full of meaning. The kind of silence that comes only after a long, deafening storm has passed. As the sky shifted into shades of indigo and the last of the guests waved their goodbyes, the family on the blanket remained. No grand declarations, no fireworks, just presence. In that small, perfect circle, a father, his twins, and the woman who taught them all how to laugh again. Family was no longer a wound. It was a promise, reborn not in perfection, but in the fierce, resilient, and breathtaking power of love. Did this story move you or remind you of someone special in your own life? We truly love to hear your stories and thoughts in the comments. Every video we share here is made with great care and dedication, sometimes taking over a week to create, because we want each story to truly mean something to you. If this touched your heart, please consider subscribing to the channel. It's the best way to support us and helps us continue bringing you more stories like this. And if it's your first time with us, feel free to explore our other videos. We made them all with you in mind. Thank you for being here with us today. Your presence means more than you know.